The second lesson for the morning is the opening chapter and really the introduction to the story of Job from the Old Testament. Get ready. There once was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold feasts in one another's houses in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and forth on the earth and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who believes in God and turns away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? Have you blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land? But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well. All that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. One day, when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabians," and these are not people from the University of Alabama, "the Sabians fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 columns, made raids on the camels, and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. Glory be to God who gives us the word. May God write that word on our hearts, and may God and God alone have received glory, honor, and praise. I went back and checked the record, and it seems that I have never, in 31 years of ministry or even before, I have never preached a sermon on any portion of the book of Job. For reasons that appear questionable and borderline ridiculous, I decided to preach this morning on this incredibly difficult book of the Old Testament. I must not have had enough coffee that morning. A couple of things about the book of Job by way of introduction. We know very little about why, where, or when, or by whom this story was written. It is a story, a parable. It did not happen. The person of Job never existed, and none of what we ever read happened in the way we read it. The story has more twists and turns than a roller coaster. The question of why suffering exists is at the very heart of the story. There is a cast of more than interesting characters. There is destruction, death, and so much more. The latter chapters of the book contain a host of questions presented in such poetic beauty that it cannot help but move us. But the story has some significant problems. Virginia Woolf spoke for many readers of Job when she wrote to a friend, "I read the book of Job last night. I don't think God comes out of it well." God allows the suffering of Job and seems unmoved by Job's suffering. That's a problem. Then there's the problem of Satan. Now we need to clear up the translation problems. Satan in Hebrew means accuser or even adversary. In the story of Job, Satan always carries with it the prefix ha. Ha-Satan. Ha is the definite article the. If we were reading it literally, we would read the Satan, the Satan, the accuser. Try to get the Miltonian idea of a devil out of your mind when you read Job. The Satan appears to be one of the heavenly beings whose job it is to accuse mortal beings of sin and corruption. Now, we could spend weeks on this story, and maybe someday we will, but for today, we are only considering the opening of the story, the first chapter. And in that consideration, we will ask the trickiest question of all. So you have to buy the whole premise of the story. The story begins with the protagonist, Job. Job is described as blameless and upright, one who believes in God and turned away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and in a word, was loaded. He had everything he would ever need and more. There were trust funds for the kids, people to wait on him hand and foot. Job wanted for nothing. But Job was also a deeply faithful man. His children were known to throw good parties, parties that would last for days. When the parties came to their end, Job would rise early in the morning and offer sacrifices just in case his children in their revelries had sinned and offended God. That's Job. Scene change. Now we're in the heavenly court. The heavenly beings come before God, and among them is the accuser. God strikes up a conversation. "Where you been?" "Well, I've been traveling the earth," says the accuser, with the intention that it was an information-gathering mission. "Did you run into my servant Job?" God asked. "Job is one of the very best." "Well, of course he's one of the best," says the accuser. "You've given him everything. You've coddled him, you've sheltered him, you've nearly packaged him in bubble wrap. But if you took all the stuff away, he'd drop you like a hot rock." "Really?" says God. "Would you like to make a wager?" "Done," says the accuser. "Well, now here's the condition," God says. "Everything that Job owns is now under your control. You can do with all of that as you please. But you cannot touch or harm Job." "Agreed," says the accuser. End of scene. Now we're in Job's house. A messenger arrives. The messenger tells Job that a band of nomads called the Sabians conducted a raid that killed all of the oxen and the donkeys and the field hands who were using them to plow. At that moment, another messenger runs into the house with the news that fire from heaven fell and burned up all the sheep and all the shepherds. Another messenger runs in to announce that the Chaldeans have conducted a raid, stealing all of Job's camels and killing all the camel keepers. And then another messenger rushes in to say that a desert wind has knocked down the tent where Job's children were feasting, killing all of Job's children. You have never had a day as bad as Job's. Give thanks. Job stands to his feet, tears his garment in a sign of mourning, a custom still observed among some Jews to this day, shaves his head, which is a sign of mourning and loss, and falls face down on the ground and worships God. Job says in a more literal translation, "Naked I came from Mother Earth, and naked I shall return to her. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And that opening scene concludes with the narrator telling us, in all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. Job never blamed God. Job never questioned God. Job never cried out to God in anger or rage. And the opening to the story is over. But the very opening of the story prompts a slew of questions. What kind of God allows a faithful follower to suffer such devastation? Why do disasters happen? Are they some kind of test? Why does Job believe so completely in God? And why doesn't Job abandon God when disaster comes? Do human beings believe and serve God because of what they receive from God? Questions pour from the story, and we've only heard the introduction. But perhaps there's another question that needs to be asked. It's a tricky question. So often, whenever we hear about the story of Job, the question asked is, does Job have faith in God? You can absolutely approach the story in that manner. The story begins with the accuser asking essentially that question. Still, in the conversation between God and the accuser, another question looms in the background. As God and the accuser speak and discuss Job, the question seems to be, does God have faith in Job? Does God know Job well enough to know that Job will not abandon God, reject God, and turn away from God? God is basically making a bet with the accuser, but the accuser puts God in a no-win situation with his question. Does Job believe in God for nothing? Does Job love God because of all the stuff? If you take all the stuff away, will Job still love you? Now, if God refuses the accuser's wager, it looks as if God accepts the idea that Job loves God because of all the stuff. If God accepts the accuser's wager, it will look as though God is heartless and merciless in the face of suffering. So God considers, mulls over, contemplates the faith of Job. Will Job abandon faith in the face of calamity? Or will Job remain faithful to God and offer God worship and praise? The question is, does God have faith in Job? Okay, here's where it gets a little uncomfortable. If we ask that question of Job, then it is a question we need to ask ourselves. If God were betting against the accuser, would God place the bet on you, on me? Does God trust in us? Are we living examples of who God is and what God is all about? Do we pursue justice, which is love in action? Do we practice compassion, which is love made visible? Do we live humbly with God and our neighbors? Does God have faith in us? Are we willing to take risks for those who are treated unfairly and unjustly? Are we less interested in our own comforts and more interested in seeing that all people have what they need? Are we willing to practice a generosity that is God-inspired and live a little more simply and help others simply live? Does God believe we are that kind of people? Are we willing to speak the truth and demand that the truth be spoken? Do we live up to the promises we make, or are we lured away by the siren voices that tempt and seduce us? Are we faithful to our family and friends as God is faithful to us? Do we accept and welcome those we meet, or do we harbor prejudice and hatred towards some? Does God have faith in us? That's the trickiest question of all. If asked if we have faith in God, if we trust God in all the circumstances of life, we would probably answer yes, even if there are times when that faith is a little shaky. We know we're not always as trusting and confident when it comes to God as we could be. We know there are times when our faith lags and our confidence in God droops. We know that, and we trust that God forgives those lapses. But when you turn the question around and ask, does God have faith in me, in us? Well, it gets a little more real. Would God bet the future of the planet on us? Would God wager all that God is, was, and ever will be on our faithfulness and trust? Does God have faith in us? In spite of every reason to believe otherwise, I think the answer is yes. I think God knows that we are capable of being the people God calls us to be, to live as God calls us to live, and to love as God calls us to love. I truly believe that. I think God believes in us even when we fail to meet the mark that God has set. God believes in us, and when we don't live up to that level of trust, God forgives and calls us to get back to it. If you're a little concerned about how much you are deserving of God's trust, make some changes. If you already know where those changes need to happen, get on with it. If you need some help and encouragement, that's why we're here. But the good news for today is this: God has faith in us for now and evermore. Amen.